At approximately 8:30 on the morning of April 18, 1912, the RMS Carpathia docked at Pier 54 in New York City. Word had spread across the country since the first wireless reports 3 days earlier. 30,000 people had gathered in the streets around the pier in the rain. Among them were journalists from every major newspaper in the country, grieving families holding photographs of people they had not yet confirmed were dead, and crowds drawn by the specific kind of pull that historic disasters exert, the need to witness, even at a distance, something that has already changed the world. The gangplank came down, and the survivors of the Titanic walked out into a city that did not know what to do with them. 706 people had been pulled from the lifeboats in those dark waters 4 days earlier. They arrived in New York in borrowed clothes, wrapped in blankets taken from Carpathia passengers who had stripped their own cabins for the rescued. Some had lost their shoes climbing into the boats. Some had lost their families. Some had lost everything except the specific, permanent, unreachable memory of standing on a deck in the North Atlantic at 2 in the morning watching a ship go down. Here is what the history books almost never tell you about the Titanic. The sinking lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. The aftermath lasted lifetimes. Some of those 706 people went on to live extraordinary lives, lives that the disaster, counterintuitively, made larger and more purposeful. Some were destroyed by it in ways that took years to fully manifest. Some went home and never spoke of it again. Some spoke of it constantly and were destroyed by that instead. And a remarkable number of them, more than most people realize, died by their own hands. Not in 1912. Years, sometimes decades later. The water that had spared their bodies reached their minds on a slower schedule and with equal thoroughness. This is the story of what the Titanic did to the people it didn't kill. And it is, in its own way, as dark as anything that happened that night in the Atlantic. Subscribe to this channel right now, because the story of the Titanic survivors is one that almost nobody has ever told completely, and what it reveals about trauma, guilt, class, and what survival actually costs is more relevant to the world we live in now than most people expect. When the Carpathia arrived at Pier 54, Margaret Tobin Brown was one of the first survivors off the gangplank. She was 55 years old. She had been awake for most of 4 days, and she carried herself with the bearing of someone who had made decisions in a lifeboat at 2 in the morning and was still making them. Margaret Brown, who disliked the nickname Molly and rarely used it herself, a detail that the Broadway musical and the subsequent mythology conveniently ignored, had spent the hours aboard the Carpathia doing exactly what she had done aboard Lifeboat 6, organizing. She established a survivors committee. She went from survivor to survivor with food and blankets. She raised money for those who had lost everything. By the time the ship docked, she had collected $10,000 from Carpathia passengers for the survivors. By the time she reached the pier, she was already famous. The American press needed a hero from the Titanic. The disaster was too large for the public to process without one. Margaret Brown, the self-made woman from a Colorado mining town who had made herself into a society figure through sheer force of personality, who had argued in a lifeboat with a crewman too frightened to row back and rescue people drowning in the water, was the hero they chose. She became the unsinkable Molly Brown, a character who was real and mythologized simultaneously, and who spent the rest of her life navigating the space between those two things. What she did with the fame is the part of her story that the Broadway musical understandably compressed. She ran for the United States Senate in Colorado in 1914, 6 years before the 19th Amendment gave women the constitutional right to vote. She didn't complete the campaign, but the candidacy alone, in 1914, represents a kind of audacity that the Titanic's famous name amplified but did not create. She worked as director of the American Committee for Devastated France during World War I. She advocated for labor rights, for literacy programs, for the rights of minors' children in the Colorado communities where she had grown up. She worked for the establishment of a juvenile court system in Denver. She died in 1932 in New York City of a brain tumor. She was 65. The woman who had refused to let lifeboat Titanic's crewmen row away from drowning people spent the 20 years after the Titanic doing the same thing she had done in that boat, making herself useful, loudly, to people who needed it. She was, genuinely, unsinkable, not in the metaphorical sense that postcards and Broadway shows use the word, in the practical sense that matters more. She came through the worst night of her life and spent the rest of her life doing something with it. Leave a like right now. Because the contrast between what happened to Margaret Brown and what happened to the man who owned the ship is one of the most devastating comparisons in the entire story. J. Bruce Ismay stepped off the Carpathia at Pier 54 and disappeared into a car that had been arranged for him. He did not face the crowds. He did not give interviews. He went directly to a private residence in New York and immediately requested a ship back to England. Ismay was the managing director of the White Star Line, the highest-ranking officer of the company that owned the Titanic, the man who had sat in the meeting where the number of lifeboats was reduced from 64 to 20. He had survived the sinking by stepping into collapsible sea, one of the last lifeboats, when no women or children were visible in his immediate vicinity. That decision, and its consequences, would follow him for the remaining 25 years of his life with a consistency that amounted to a second punishment for a verdict that was never formally issued. The American press attacked him immediately and without mercy. Newspapers depicted him as a coward who had dressed as a woman to get into a lifeboat, a lie, documented as such, that Ismay was never fully able to dislodge from public consciousness. William Randolph Hearst's papers gave him a nickname, J. Brute Ismay. The editorial cartoons showed him stepping over drowning bodies to reach the lifeboat. Senator William Alden Smith, who chaired the American Senate inquiry into the disaster, questioned him for days with a hostility that went beyond investigation into something closer to prosecution. Ismay testified that he had helped load other passengers into boats throughout the evacuation. He testified that he had only entered the lifeboat when there was no one else nearby to take his place. The Senate inquiry cleared him of any legal wrongdoing. The court of public opinion did not. He returned to England, resigned from the White Star Line in 1913, and attempted to do something that the press had made essentially impossible: disappear. He retreated to a remote house in County Galway on the west coast of Ireland, as far from London society and the shipping world as a wealthy Englishman could reasonably get. He rarely left. He rarely gave interviews. He spent his days fishing and walking and trying to construct a life that could contain what had happened without being entirely defined by it. He failed at the last part. His great-grandson Malcolm Chabe, speaking to the BBC nearly a century later, was direct. I suspect he suffered from post-traumatic stress. The isolation, the silence, the way he refused, for the rest of his life, to discuss the Titanic publicly or to engage with any of the inquiries, books, or commemorations that accumulated over the decades. These are the behaviors of a man who cannot afford to revisit what he is carrying. Ismay died in 1937 at the age of 74, having outlived his public reputation by a quarter century. He never recovered it. Whether he deserved to, whether the man who reduced the lifeboats from 64 to 20 and then survived in one of the 20 should have been forgiven by the people who could not, is a question that the historical record cannot answer and that every person who encounters it has to answer for themselves. Frederick Fleet was the lookout who saw the iceberg first. At 11:40 on the night of April 14, 1912, Fleet was in the crow's nest of the Titanic when he spotted something dark in the water ahead. He picked up the telephone and called the bridge. Iceberg right ahead. He was the first person on the ship to know what was coming. He watched the iceberg scrape the side of the hull. He survived in Lifeboat 6. At the Senate inquiry, Fleet was asked why he hadn't seen the iceberg sooner. He explained that the lookouts had not been provided with binoculars, that the binoculars for the crow's nest had been locked in a cabinet whose key was held by an officer who had left the ship in Southampton. With binoculars, he said, he might have seen the iceberg 10 minutes earlier rather than 37 seconds. The questioning senators moved on. Fleet's answer sat in the record, unacknowledged, for decades. Fleet spent the rest of his working life in the shipping industry, for a while as a seaman, later selling newspapers on the Southampton docks. He married, had a life, aged quietly. And then, in 1965, his wife died. His brother-in-law asked him to leave the house they had shared. At the age of 76, Frederick Fleet was effectively homeless and entirely alone. On January 10, 1965, he died by suicide. He was 76 years old. He had spent 53 years after the Titanic carrying something that, in the end, he could not put down. The man who had seen the iceberg first, who had done exactly what he was supposed to do, who had picked up the telephone and said the words and watched the ship try to turn, had spent more than 5 decades living in a world that remembered those words without always remembering to think about what it had cost the man who said them. The psychological literature on disaster survivors did not exist in 1912. The word trauma was not yet used in the way that the 20th century would eventually use it. What we now call post-traumatic stress disorder was not a diagnostic category. The people who climbed onto the Carpathia that April morning with frost-burned hands and the sound of screaming people still in their ears had no framework, no clinical language, no therapeutic apparatus, no cultural permission to describe what they were experiencing. They went home. They went back to work. They were expected to recover, because recovery was what people did in 1912. The expectation of recovery was not cruelty. It was simply the only available option in a world that had not yet built the infrastructure for understanding what mass trauma does to the human mind. What it did, in the absence of any other outlet, was find its own way out. Jack Thayer was 17 years old on the night the Titanic sank. He had been separated from his parents in the chaos of the evacuation. His mother survived. His father did not. He jumped from the ship as it went under and spent an hour in the North Atlantic clinging to the hull of an overturned collapsible lifeboat, surrounded by men who died of hypothermia around him one by one in the dark. He was pulled out of the water and survived. He went on to a distinguished life. He attended the University of Pennsylvania, married, had children, became the financial vice president of the University of Pennsylvania. He was, by every external measure, a successful man. He wrote a privately published memoir about his experiences on the Titanic that remained one of the most precisely observed first-hand accounts of the sinking. In 1945, his son Edward was killed in combat in the Pacific theater of World War II. That same year, on an anniversary of the Titanic's sinking, his mother died. Jack Thayer died by suicide in 1945. He was 50 years old. The quartermaster Robert Hickens was the man at the wheel of the Titanic when it struck the iceberg. He had executed the order to turn as hard as he could in those final 37 seconds. He survived in Lifeboat 6, where his arguments with Margaret Brown about whether to row back for survivors became part of the historical record. Hickens refused. The boat did not go back. In the years that followed, Hickens's life deteriorated in ways that those who study survivor trauma have since recognized as characteristic. Chronic alcohol abuse, a damaged marriage, an attempted murder charge in the 1930s, 2 suicide attempts, a prison sentence. The man at the wheel when the ship hit the iceberg spent the rest of his life in various forms of crisis, none of which he appears to have been given any framework to understand or any tools to address. What is striking about these stories, read together, is not their uniqueness. It is their pattern, the specific cocktail of survivor guilt, traumatic memory, social pressure, and the absence of any therapeutic infrastructure produced outcomes that followed a recognizable arc. Even in people of very different backgrounds, very different personalities, very different relationships to what had happened. The water found them all, eventually, just on different schedules. Comment below, because the question of what we owe survivors of disasters, and what society's failure to support them costs in the long run, is not an abstract historical question. It is a question that every major disaster since the Titanic has asked again. Not every survivor story moves toward darkness. Some move in directions that are remarkable for opposite reasons. Violet Jessup was a ship's stewardess who had been born in Argentina to Irish immigrant parents, who had grown up on a sheep ranch in Patagonia, and who had found work in the only industry available to a young woman of her background and generation who needed employment and was willing to travel. She joined the White Star Line and spent years working aboard their transatlantic liners. In 1911, she was aboard the RMS Olympic when it collided with HMS Hawke in the Solent. The Olympic survived and made it to port. Jessup survived. In April 1912, she was a stewardess aboard the Titanic. As the ship sank, an officer ordered her and the other stewardesses into Lifeboat 16, partly, she later wrote, to demonstrate to the female passengers that the boats were safe. She climbed in. A crew member handed her a baby to hold. She reached the Carpathia, and the baby was taken from her arms by someone she never identified. She never found out what happened to it. In 1916, she was working as a nurse aboard the Britannic, the Titanic's sister ship, which had been converted to a hospital ship during World War I. The Britannic struck a German mine in the Aegean Sea and sank in 55 minutes. 30 of the 1,066 people aboard died. Jessup survived by jumping from the ship and nearly being sucked into one of the still-running propellers. She suffered a skull fracture when she hit the water. 3 ships, 3 disasters, 3 survivals. After the Britannic, she continued working at sea for another 34 years, serving for various shipping lines until she retired in 1950. She lived quietly in Suffolk, England, grew sweet peas in her garden, and died in 1971 at the age of 84. In her memoir, she described the Titanic with a specificity of recall that made clear the memory never faded, only became something she carried differently over time. She is, by any assessment, one of the more extraordinary human beings to appear in the entire history of maritime disaster. Whether she was brave or simply constitutionally unsuited to being destroyed by the things that tried to destroy her, she would probably have said she was the second thing, with the characteristic self-deprecation of someone who does not think of themselves as remarkable. Charles Lightoller was the second officer of the Titanic, the most senior officer to survive the disaster. He spent the night loading lifeboats and, at the very end, was sucked under with the ship and blasted back to the surface by a jet of water from an exploded boiler. He clung to an overturned collapsible lifeboat for the rest of the night, helping to organize the 24 men who balanced on top of it in shifting positions to keep from capsizing, until the Carpathia arrived. At the British Board of Trade inquiry that followed the disaster, Lightoller was called to testify and spent 4 days on the stand giving evidence that, historians have subsequently noted, was carefully shaped to protect the White Star Line from the full extent of its liability. He confirmed the narrative the company preferred. He minimized the extent to which the ship's speed had been reckless. He survived the inquiry professionally intact and returned to sea. When World War I broke out, Lightoller served in the Royal Navy and distinguished himself further. He sank a German submarine. He was eventually promoted to lieutenant commander. And then, in late May 1940, the German army had pushed the British Expeditionary Force to the beaches of Dunkirk, and the British government issued a desperate call to civilian boat owners to cross the English Channel and help evacuate the stranded soldiers. Lightoller was 66 years old. He had been retired for years. He took his private yacht, the Sundowner, across the channel in the middle of a war zone and brought back 130 men, a boat rated for 21, completing a crossing that the naval officers watching from shore considered impossible. The man who had organized survivors on an overturned lifeboat in the North Atlantic in 1912 organized soldiers on the beaches of France in 1940. He died in 1952 at the age of 78. He was, arguably, the most consequential survivor the Titanic produced. Subscribe to the channel right now, because the story of the Titanic orphans, which is coming next, is one of the most emotionally complex stories in this entire history, and it ends in a way that almost nobody knows. They were known as the Titanic orphans, and the name was accurate in both senses. They were orphaned by the disaster, and they were, for weeks, orphans in the bureaucratic sense of the word. Children whose identity nobody knew. Michel Navardil was 3 years old. His brother Edmond was 2. Their father, Michel Navardil Sr., a French tailor whose marriage had collapsed and whose wife had been awarded custody of the children, had taken the boys during an Easter visit and boarded the Titanic under a false name, intending to start over in America with his sons. On the night of the sinking, Michel Navardil Sr. placed his sons in Collapsible D, the last lifeboat to leave the Titanic, and did not get in himself. A French-speaking woman who had survived took the boys under her care. They arrived in New York speaking only French, knowing no one, with no way to identify themselves to authorities who didn't know their real names. Their photographs were circulated in newspapers around the world. Their mother, Marcelle Corretto, was in France with no idea where her children had gone. She saw their photographs in the newspaper on May 16, 1912, 31 days after the sinking. She crossed the Atlantic and collected them. They returned to France together. Michel Jr. grew up, earned a doctorate, became a philosophy professor at the University of Montpellier. He thought about the Titanic with the particular intensity of someone who had been too young to understand it when it happened and who had spent a lifetime developing the intellectual tools to examine it afterward. He dressed me very warmly and took me in his arms, he said in interviews of his father's final minutes with him. A stranger did the same for my brother. Then he went away. Those were the last words his father said to him. He was the last male survivor of the Titanic. He died in 2001, at the age of 92, a philosopher who had spent his career thinking about existence, consciousness, and time, subjects that perhaps look different when you have been, from the age of 3, the survivor of one of the definitive events of the century. Eva Hart was 7 years old when the Titanic sank. She remembered the night with the precision that traumatic memories sometimes produce in children, not despite their age, but in a specific way shaped by it. She remembered the cold. She remembered her father, Benjamin Hart, who would not survive. She remembered watching from the lifeboat as the ship went down. Her mother, Esther Hart, had a particular reason to be watching that night with extra dread. She had refused to sleep on the Titanic, or rather, she had refused to let herself sleep during the nights at sea. She had read the publicity materials. She had seen the phrase, unsinkable, and something in her had refused to believe it, refused with an insistence that Esther Hart herself described as irrational and that she had been unable to shake. So every night at sea, she sat up. She watched. She was awake when the ship hit the iceberg. Eva Hart grew up in England, worked as a secretary, and spent much of her adult life as one of the most articulate and most available survivors when journalists, historians, and filmmakers came looking for witnesses. She testified at the 1992 auction at which Titanic artifacts were sold, speaking against the sale with a fury that was entirely specific to someone who understood the artifacts as what they were, the personal possessions of people who had died and whose families deserved more respect than an auction catalog. Her testimony helped shape the ongoing debate about the ethics of recovering and commercializing material from the wreck. She died in 1996. Her last public interviews were given in her late 80s to filmmakers preparing for the anniversary of the disaster. She was still angry. She had not grown philosophical about it. She had grown old and she had remained angry, and she considered both the anger and the specificity of her memory to be obligations she owed to her father. Melvina Dean was 2 months old on the night of April 14, 1912. She was the youngest passenger aboard the Titanic. She had been aboard because her family, her father Bertram, her mother Eva, and her 2-year-old brother Bertram Jr., were immigrating to America, where her father planned to open a tobacco shop in Kansas City. When the Titanic struck the iceberg, Bertram Dean Sr. woke his wife and children and got them to the lifeboats. He did not survive. His wife and both children did. Melvina Dean grew up not knowing she had been on the Titanic. Her mother waited until she was 8 years old to tell her. She grew up in England, worked as a cartographer, lived quietly, and for most of her adult life was not particularly well known as a Titanic survivor, partly because she had been too young to have any memories of the disaster, and partly because she did not seek the attention. After the James Cameron film was released in 1997 and the Titanic returned to global cultural prominence, Dean became the most famous surviving survivor, the last living person who had been aboard that ship, the final human connection to a night that everyone else knew only from photographs and films and histories. She attended commemorations. She gave interviews. She sold some of her Titanic memorabilia at auction in 2008 when she needed money for nursing home care, including a small suitcase that the American Red Cross had given her family when they arrived penniless in New York in 1912 after losing everything to the sea. Melvina Dean died on May 31, 2009, at the age of 97. She was the last survivor. When she died, the link between the living present and the night of April 14, 1912, closed permanently. Everything that is known after that point is known from documents and artifacts and the recorded accounts of people who are also now gone. She left behind no memories of the event itself. She was too young, but she left behind something else. The last 97 years of a life that began in a lifeboat in the North Atlantic at 2 in the morning, carried by a mother who had survived something unsurvivable, carried through all the decades that followed. Share this video with someone who thinks the Titanic story ended when the ship went down. Because the real story, the story of what survival cost, and what some people did with it, and what others could not, went on for nearly a century after the last lifeboat was picked up. The 706 survivors of the Titanic carried with them, from the moment they boarded the Carpathia, a weight that had no contemporary name and no contemporary treatment. What we now know about PTSD, about how traumatic memories encode themselves differently than ordinary memories, about how they can remain accessible and acute for decades while other memories fade, about how the guilt of survival can become indistinguishable from the disaster itself. None of that existed as clinical knowledge in 1912. The survivors were sent home to manage it alone, with whatever resources their character, their circumstances, and their era provided. Some of them, like Margaret Brown and Charles Lightoller, seem to have found in the disaster a specific kind of clarification, a stripping away of whatever had been peripheral, leaving behind something harder and more purposeful. They emerged from the water knowing exactly what they were for. They spent the rest of their lives being it. Some of them, like Violet Jessup, seemed to have possessed from the beginning a constitutionally unusual relationship with catastrophe, the ability to be present in the worst circumstances without being shattered by them, to carry the memory without being consumed. Whether this is resilience or dissociation or something else entirely is a question that the clinical literature has not fully resolved. And some of them, Frederick Fleet, who saw the iceberg first and could not put it down. Jack Thayer, who spent an hour in the Atlantic on an overturned lifeboat and never found solid ground again. Robert Hickens, at the wheel when the ship turned and never turned back. These were men who experienced something that produced consequences their world had no language for and offered no help with. They were not weak. They were human, in circumstances that exceeded the available tools for being human. The Titanic is remembered for its dead. That is appropriate. 1,517 people died in the North Atlantic on the night of April 14, 1912, and they deserve every memorial stone and museum exhibit and film adaptation that has been produced in their honor in the centuries since. But the 706 who did not die also deserve their full story. The story of what survival costs when no one is thought to prepare you for the bill. The story of women who ran for Senate and men who went to Dunkirk and philosophers who became professors and a small girl who grew up not knowing she had been there and eventually sold a suitcase to pay for nursing home care. The story of Frederick Fleet, who saw the iceberg coming and tried to warn everyone and still spent 53 years carrying something no one helped him put down. All of these people were aboard the same ship. All of them survived the same night. And what happened to them afterward tells you something about the disaster that the number of casualties alone will never tell you. That survival is not the end of what a catastrophe does to the people it touches. It is often only the beginning. If this story changed the way you think about the Titanic, if it made the disaster feel more human, more real, more present than the film or the history books managed to make it, subscribe to this channel. This is what we do here. The complete story, told with the care that the people in it deserved. Leave a comment below with the survivor whose story affected you most. Because every single one of them, from the philosophy professor who remembered his father's last words to the lookout who saw the iceberg first and lived with that for 53 years, was a complete human being whose life extended far past the night of April 14, 1912. And that is the part of the story that deserves as much attention as the ship. There are no survivors left. Milvina Dean died in 2009. The last direct human link to that night in the Atlantic is gone. What remains is everything they told us, and the obligation, which is simply the obligation of honesty, to listen,